I'm Marty Moscow. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this special event and for your support for WHYY. We are thrilled with the level of interest in our guest, Frances Moore Lappé, and the topic, plant and planet-based eating. I invite you to ask questions during our interview, and you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can find that at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please keep them short, and I will ask as many of them as I possibly can during the hour. And we plan to broadcast this interview sometime next week. But before I talk with our guests, I want to begin with a personal story. Back in 1970, some friends of mine and I opened a vegetarian macrobiotic restaurant outside of Atlanta, Georgia, called Morning Star Inn. Now, mind you, we had absolutely no business sense. We had no restaurant cooking experience at all, but this was 50 years ago, and you could frankly do these kinds of things. We bought 100-pound bags of short grain brown rice, boxes of fresh vegetables, giant sacks of flour, and tubs of oil, and voila, we opened the door. We made our share of terrible meals, but before long, we eventually got the hang of it. And one of the books that inspired us was Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé. It included recipes, but even more importantly, it gave us a philosophy and a way of thinking about food and eating and, frankly, living. So I am thrilled to talk with her as we mark the 50th anniversary of her book, which has been updated. She has been called the Julia Child of the soybean circuit. And Frances Moore Lappé, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Marty. It's my great pleasure.
You know, I want to start with the title of your book, and I know you're not entirely, or we're not entirely comfortable with it, but Diet for a Small Planet. Small meaning interconnected, that we,
exactly.
That what made it small is that we are all interconnected. And I wonder whether the planet feels even smaller today, because it feels as if between COVID and climate and everything else, we are in each other's lives in a unique kind of way.
I think that sense is growing. That, as a dear friend of mine told me, Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts, only participants. We are all connected, and therefore every choice we make and don't make, it is rippling out and affecting everything. So I think that is growing consciousness, definitely.
Your book came out a little more than 50 years ago. It became a bestseller. It's now been reissued 50 years later. Were you, and are you still surprised at the interest in this book of yours that I'm holding up here?
Yes, I guess I thought it might appeal to 500 people in the greater Bay Area in California, where I lived. And my dad believed in it, though. And so I didn't know. I just knew I had to share what I was learning, because I was so shocked, because we were living in this world in which we were told that we were running out of everything. You know, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, just kind of exploded. And people were saying they couldn't have children because there wasn't enough. And I had to know, was that true? And when I found out, no, there's plenty. And we are actually creating the experience of scarcity out of plenty. I just had to tell, even if nobody read it.
Well, a lot of people obviously did read it, and I do want to get to all of that, but I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that you grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, a quintessential cow town. Can I assume, as a kid growing up in the 50s, 60s, that it was steak and potatoes, that was a dinner at
I would say
house?
Hamburgers and meatloaf, but yes. Definitely. Stockyards were not far away, and Cowtown was a cow town, and I never questioned any of it.
You write about it, and I do remember this back in the 50s, that there was this focus on protein. You know, you need to have enough protein. In order to get enough protein, you had to eat meat. Can you speak to that?
Yes, that when I wrote the book, when Diet came out, I had people come to me and say, oh, thank you. You made peace in my family, because my parents thought I was going to die of protein malnutrition if I didn't eat meat. And you clarified, no, we're getting more than enough protein. Americans now eat twice the protein their bodies can even use. And remember, we don't store it, so it's just used as energy. So I think that was a big piece of what I offered people, is just whoa, take a deep breath. Yes, you don't have to worry about protein. If you eat healthfully, and if you eat a variety of foods, and some in the plants called the legumes of peas, beans, and lentils, they are particularly rich in protein, but it's not a problem.
You have an interesting story to tell that has to do with Philadelphia. In fact, you worked here in the city in the 60s, 67, 68. You were a community organizer. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but you worked with the Welfare Rights Organization, working with low-income families. What brought you here and what did you learn?
It was life-changing. Imagine a time when the city of Philadelphia paid this young woman of 23 to go door to door to help welfare recipients understand what their rights were. And the goal, it was the housing authority, the goal was to enable people to get out from the burden of slumlords who were not repairing and were overcharging, and to empower themselves. And I was so happy. I was so accepted, knock, 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 and people let me in, and we created a group. But what was life-changing is the woman I got most attached to, Lily, died of a heart attack in her early 40s. These were all African-American women. And I was convinced that Lily died not of a heart attack, but of poverty. And I had to get to the roots of her death. And that led me directly then, once I got to Berkeley, to try to dig, what is underneath all of this suffering? And that's when it dawned on me that food would be the way in, because we all eat, we know how much we need. And if I could understand why people are hungry, then that would help me understand the causes of this needless suffering. And that's what I did. I went to the library.
You went to the library. And did you, when you were working in Philadelphia, though, working with low-income families, probably moms, you saw what they could feed their children? I mean, did you see literally what was in their refrigerator, what they were cooking for dinner?
No, not really. That was before my particular food focus. I just know that they never had enough. There was stress, and that stress led, I believe, to a heart attack. So it was after I got to Berkeley, my first husband, a brilliant scientist, he got a postdoc, and I therefore had access to the Berkeley libraries. And that's when I realized that to go beneath the symptoms of stress, I had to ask a most fundamental question. Why are people hungry? Is it really true? The scarcity scare, that we've run out, is that really true? And that was my beginning.
Well, you mentioned Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb. This was a really influential book in the late 1960s, saying there are too many people on the planet. We have to stop having babies. And that's the way we're going to deal with this scarcity problem, scarcity of food. You really turned that on its head.
Yeah, it was taking my dad's slide rule, if any of you know what that is, but it was beforehand calculators, to the library, and literally put two and two together with the help of a friendly librarian. And I said, wait a minute, there's more than enough for all of us, that we are actually creating the experience of scarcity out of plenty. And that, as I said, I just had to tell the world. And I learned then, a lot of ways of explaining that. With this grain-fed, meat-centered diet, we use, listen to this is just crazy to me. We use 80% of our agricultural land to produce meat that provide us only 18% of our calories. I mean, just logically, that doesn't make any sense. So we've created this great, sort of shrinking machine, I think. But in any case, I learned, there's so much I've learned since then, but because then we were just awakening with help of Rachel Carson's book. We were just beginning to understand the threats of the pesticides that we were using to grow these crops. So half of our harvested acreage now, by the way, goes into feedstock, goes into feed and fuel, not directly to people. So there's just so much built-in waste in our system. And it's more than waste, though. It is highly, highly destructive in terms of biodiversity and in terms of poisoning farm workers, et cetera. So there's so many things I've learned since I wrote the book.
Well, you have a handy phrase that the cattle is a protein factory in reverse, which I think you really just described, that the amount of
Yes.
that it takes to feed a cow doesn't really give you the right kind of formula if you want to
Right.
feed the world.
Here's another dramatic statistic that of the protein fed to cattle, we get 3% back in protein for us. So that's a pretty low return. So there's a lot of ways to see the irrationality of what we've created and the destructiveness of the natural environment and of our own bodies. And we can talk about that too.
Sure. You grew up in Cowtown, Texas. So when's the last time you had a hamburger or a steak?
Well, I
Do you
tell the
even
story.
remember?
Yes, because I confess at the end of the first chapter, of the opening chapter for the new book, I tell the story of my dear friend. He's still a very close friend, and my last hamburger. Well, Lloyd, my friend, was a volunteer editor for Diet for a Small Planet, the very first copy, and I was pregnant then, right at the time that it was finishing up. And sometimes pregnant women have cravings. And I had this strange craving. And there I was standing in the smokehouse on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley when none other than Lloyd walks in. And that was my last. I don't even think I got there to the counter, but that was my last craving for that. And speaking of cravings, can I just go a bit on about it? Because I realize I haven't shared this much, but I was a classic female obsessive about weight, body shape and weight and calorie counting. I always wanted to lose those 10 or 15 pounds. And then when I moved to this plant and planet-centered diet, it was amazing. My taste and my desire just came into balance. I never counted calories. I never had wild cravings. I just ate what I loved, and I was free. It wasn't like a sacrifice, it was freedom. And I just want to underscore that because I don't often share that part of it, very personal part.
Well, I appreciate that. Are you a pescatarian, a vegetarian, a vegan? Have you picked your category?
Well, I call myself plant-centered. I don't eat any animal foods, but animal meat type foods. I do eat some dairy, and I'm thinking now more and more about trying to reduce that also. But I definitely eat in the plant world, like 85% of everything, all the calories I eat.
Let me read a couple of comments from some of the people listening to us. This is Nature Jack from Ballacoonawood asks, he says, in the 70s, my mother used to eat roasted soybeans. And then he asks, are they good for you? Are they?
Soybeans are one of the greatest foods, actually. That's where tofu is from, and so many things you can do with it. So yes, soybeans are very rich in nutrients and in protein for people concerned about that, because actually all legumes have a lot of protein for us. But, you can just do so many things with soybeans that, yeah, absolutely.
And here's a comment from Parul who says, does Frances believe that veganism is significantly more beneficial to our health and to the planet than vegetarianism?
Well, I think we're really talking about a whole spectrum. And I hate to be an absolutist. And I think I'm kind of in the big tent category, that the more that any of us can move into the plant and planet-centered eating, the better. And, not to wag our fingers at people, well, if you occasionally have some cheese or if you occasionally have an animal product, I think it's more to invite people to experiment and to have the fun of trying new foods and new combinations of foods, and how much better they might feel, like I did when I shifted to a plant-centered diet. So I guess that's the spirit of all of my writing, is invitation and all of the advantages. I just love it. It's a win-win-win, because our bodies feel better, we feel better, the earth does better, the animals do better. It's what's not to like about that? So it's just asking people to embrace and not to feel scolded. I think that's really important.
Well, it's interesting you said that because I was wondering whether you think there is too much shaming about food. I mean, obviously you have been writing and talking for 50 years now about just how we have to really reorient ourselves in terms of what is good for the planet, what is good for us. But I wonder if there isn't too much finger wagging going on when it comes to what other people eat.
Well, I know I don't have a point of view. I just know what I try to do. And I think the people in my world, my daughter, especially, who has taken on taken such leadership in the world of good food, plant-based. So I think her approach, my approach, the people I know, it's much more about look at all the advantages for you and your family. And feeling good about that you're aligning your choices with what the earth can best support. And now that climate change is such a big part of the equation, 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are from our food system. And if we move to a plant-centered diet, that could eliminate as much as 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So that's huge. So I just like to point to the great advantages.
Well, speaking of that, you wrote something interesting recently, and I'm pretty much quoting here. If cows formed their own country, they would be the world's sixth greatest emitter of greenhouse gases. And I'm imagining a country of cows. I'll
Cow
put that
country,
over there. Yeah, but I get what you're saying as a way of helping people think about all the impacts of eating meat. And I think that if carnivores, and some of my best friends are carnivores, if they went to a meat processing factory, they would probably give up eating meat.
Yes, they're definitely. I don't want to skirt the animal cruelty piece of it. When I was writing the book, how many animals are crammed in these small spaces, not really able to be what they evolved to be. They're just things to us. And I think that is so cruel. And so I want to add here also, in addition to climate change, of course, it is part of the climate change and biodiversity disaster, is that so much of the rainforest destruction is due to growing crops for feed and grazing livestock. And the disaster of the Amazon destruction is huge. And most of that is from, as I say, raising meat effectively. Yeah.
Well, I was describing, 50 years ago when your book came out, and a sort of fledgling vegetarian, if I can put it that way, trying to figure out how to put a meal together. Now you go to just a regular everyday supermarket, and there might be a small organic section. There are lots more herbs and spices and things that just were not readily available 50 years ago.
Yes, that's true. 50 years ago, you had to go to the food cooperative if there was one. And but now, actually the stores I go to, there's quite a lot of organic and great looking produce that's so mouth-wateringly tempting. So it's part of this message of, this is not a sacrifice. This is a discovery and a joy. And I hope that I can't say that enough. I can say it's many times as I feel it. Thank you.
Sure. And the food sort of speaks for itself. I noticed your cookbook of 50 years ago had margarine. That's out. And now we've got butter, right? I think that's progress, frankly.
Yeah. Well, you know what I learned? I learned that the sugar industry wanted to divert attention from the hazard of sugar and tried to focus us on the danger of animal fat. And I fell for it. And therefore, at the time, and it was all about margarine. And that was one of the arguments my daughter Anna made to me. She said, "Mom, do you know how many margarine references you have? We've got to redo the book and get rid of that." So they're all gone now, because now we know, the joys are not just of olive oil, but coconut oil and all sorts of things that can help us enjoy eating.
Here's some more questions from our listeners. Shirley asks, I'm concerned about the rest of the things that are listed on the packages of the plant-based products. Can you address my concern? And it is true on, some products, if you look at the ingredients, some of them are unpronounceable. How should we understand that?
Well, I think be very wary. I would not go in that direction. Last time I looked, there were something like 5,000 additives in one of these products that who knows what they are. And also you don't get the fiber. And I think fiber is this great underappreciated part of our diet that only, fairly recently have I started to understand how important that part of plant and planet-centered diet is. And so these highly processed, fake burgers, I call them, they deprive us of that, and we really don't know what we're getting. That's really scary. So I don't encourage it. I don't encourage it.
And my understanding is that it's the vegetarians who are eating the fake meat, not the carnivores who are saying, oh, I'm going to give up steak and eat fake meat. They're still sticking with their meat.
And I love bean burgers, and we have recipes for that in the book. And I love chomping down on a bun and with something yummy in the middle, and we can create those that are really good for us.
You say something, it's just one little sentence in your book, and it is about meat, and you say meat tastes good. I mean, it's been a while since I've had a hamburger or something like that, but it does taste good. So we're sort of up against the particular unique taste of a steak or even a hamburger.
Yeah. A lot of things taste good, I guess, is my response. And there are just so many advantages. And I couldn't stress more the health advantages. Do you know that I just learned after I finished the new opening chapter that in 2015, if you can go to the World Health Organization website, 2015, World Health Organization declared meat a probable carcinogen and beef a carcinogen. Excuse me, and beef a probable carcinogen and processed meat a carcinogen. So I said, what? I didn't know that. That was 2015. So we know that a plant-centered diet does reduce the risk of certain cancer, but also, if we're eating in this plant diverse world, we greatly reduce, if not eliminate, diabetes, and just overall, blood pressure, heart disease, all of that, we do better. And there's a lot of evidence for that now, including longevity. So, I just guess my response is that we have so many reasons to move away from that toward something really, really positive.
We're also up against that taste, the sugar, fat, salt, right? I mean,
yes.
Foods are filled with that, and they do get your taste buds going. So we're kind of up against a desire, I think, for that experience as eaters.
Yes, and I've never said this either, but I have a new idea for an emotion that could help us get over that. And that is anger, because I get angry when I read about how the food industry has deliberately concocted these particular combination of additives and processing this ultra processed foods, and then place them right at the place where in the grocery store where you can do an impulse buy. And they knew that they were getting us hooked. And some have said that this is just like any other drug or alcohol kind of thing, that you really can get hooked on it. And I think anger is an appropriate response to that. So maybe we can stoke our anger at the people who got us hooked on it and say, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fall for your game.
Well, you're also talking about an army of lobbyists who help to create food policy in this country.
And there are more agribusiness lobbyists than there are oil and gas lobbyists in the US. And I also want to underscore, and this is the tragic part of this for me additionally, is that this highly processed and with all these additives, that is now being pushed around the world into the poorest communities. And so I talked to a doctor in India who told me that 20, 30 years ago, his patients who came were undernourished. He said now they're getting enough calories, but they're getting diabetes and heart disease and all sorts of things. And these are very poor rural people. And this is just got to stop. I mean, that is, to me, a violation of human rights in a way, of if that's the only thing that people have available to them are these products that are making them sick and other people extremely wealthy.
Well, let me get back to some of some more questions here. Robert asks, any suggestions for stretching vegetable ingredients even farther? How to make full use of the parts of ingredients that would normally go into the trash or the compost heap? That's a big, broad, general question. What do you think?
Yeah, I could probably do better at that too. But yeah, I mean, I think, if you put some part of, say that the tail end of a eggplant or something, if you put that in the blender and it comes out in little pieces, then you can just put it into part of whatever dish you're creating, a soup or a casserole. I like that question. I could probably do better on that score.
I think we all could. I mean, food waste is such a huge issue. I mean, in this country and probably other industrialized countries as well.
Oh, it is a massive, massive problem and tragedy, considering what it takes to grow it and all the people who need it.
Olivia asks, I have been plant-based for over 7 years, mostly because of the impact of animal agriculture on the environment. My question is that even though I'm plant-based, my cat is not and should not be. I often wonder, people stop eating meat, but pets do not. Is that going to negate the reduction? So can our cat eat meat?
Yes, I think we should make exceptions for cats.
Let's see. Here's Robin, who says, as a longtime vegan, I frequently encounter people who can't imagine not eating meat. How do we get the greater population interested in eating more plants?
Invite them into your kitchen and have them have fun helping you make something that is really tasty. And maybe ask your friends, what are the kinds of herbs and cuisines that you like? Is it more the Latin American or the Italian or the French? And then do a version of it with them and bring them into the process. I think that might be the way. Again, invite rather than wag finger, right?
We've been talking about, plant-based and eating healthy. And I mean, in many ways, especially with inflation, the price of a piece of meat is just enormously expensive. And on the other hand, we have in Philadelphia and in a lot of other cities, these food deserts, other parts of the country where there is not a supermarket. There might be some corner stores, but if you wanted to get some fresh apples or some fresh broccoli or something else in that's healthy, you'd have to have a car and drive somewhere. How do we deal with the problem of food deserts?
Well, there is no obviously simple answer. And that is why I walk on these 2 feet of, yes, my Diet for a Small Planet foot, and also my How Do We Create Real Democracy in America foot, because our political system has been so corrupted by the influence of private, particularly corporate influence, that, we don't have a voice, and poor people especially. So this is all solvable, right? But we have to have our elected officials listening to us and not industry. Let me just say that there are now about more than 20 lobbyists in Washington for every person that you and I have elected to represent us there. So that we need to weigh in as citizens to get money out of politics, and that means protecting voting rights, which is a big deal right now that President Biden is stepping up on, because right now voting rights have been so suppressed. So there's no simple answer to that, but there is a foundational answer, and that is democracy, in which we, the citizens, nobody wants food deserts except people who'd rather put their store in a wealthier area and make more money, right? We want everyone to have access to healthy food. And I think the vast, who would not be against that? So clearly democracy, true accountable democracy is the answer.
You have described yourself as a child of the 60s. I too am a child of the 60s. You think there are some lessons from that time that we can apply to today, and you're absolutely right, we're in the throes of a lot of political upheavals and some, some very critical issues that seem to be at stake. Are there lessons that you learned from the 60s that can be applied to today?
Yes, I think my primary lesson in life, but started back then, was this idea that human beings do not need certainty of outcome. We just need to believe there is a chance. That is, it might be possible that we can make a difference and we'll step in. And we can't underestimate the capacity for surprise, because when I was growing up, Lyndon B. Johnson was probably growing up in Texas, where he was from, right? The last person I would have imagined. Would I have predicted that our efforts in the civil rights movement, because that's what I felt I was part of when I was going door to door in Philly, would I have predicted that he would be the person to pass civil rights and voting rights? No. And so I think this biggest lesson for me is that it's not possible to know what's possible. So I don't call myself an optimist, but I call myself a possibilist. And I think that is all we humans need. And just remember that try to maybe make a list tonight of the things that have happened in your life that you would never have thought to be possible until they really did happen. And I think to keep that spirit is the core to stay alive in this very troubled era.
I don't know if you call yourself a hope monger or if people have called you a hope monger. Which one is it?
Well, I kind of like it. I got kind of attached to it. But it's hope is a certain kind. And I think, honestly, that wishful thinking is not hope. Hope comes from taking action. Because if we're not in action doing something, how can we believe that others will change and find a pathway toward more life-serving planet, right? So action is the basis of hope that is useful. And that's what I mean as a hope monger, is a hope and action monger.
You've been arrested, right? You were arrested a couple of years ago for some voting activism.
Yes, I walked, believe it or not, again, it's not possible to know what's possible, Marty. I didn't think I could walk 10 miles, and I walked 100 and something miles from Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell, to Washington, D.C., the Capitol steps, where I sat in for the kinds of bills that are now just hopefully can pass for voting rights. And we were all arrested in maybe one of the largest sit-ins ever on the Capitol steps. And it was life-changing. And I met so many people there who are continued central in my life. And so I think, again, it's not possible. So it's possible. I made it over 100 miles.
I mean, it's an interesting connection between diet and democracy, right?
Yes, absolutely. Because I know that fundamentally, yes, I can help to enlighten people about all the topics we're talking about, but to make them real, again, we have to have a democracy that is accountable to us. And sadly, we rank very low among, industrial countries, or beyond that, depending on who's counting, we rank below 50, 60 countries in the quality of our democracy, whereas we're told that we're the best. So democracy is my sort of heartthrob.
Your heartthrob?
Yeah, my heartthrob, because it is, I think it's the only way of living that is aligned with human nature, that what brings out the best in us. We have this idea we're just selfish little shoppers and we can only rely on that marketplace. But actually, I believe that human beings have three deep needs. That is, for connection with each other, for meaning in our lives, and for a sense of agency or power. So connection, meaning, and power. And only a democracy can meet those needs. And therefore, that is the way to enhance all of life, because as those needs are met, then we can think of our fellow humans and all the creatures we can't see in the earth and in the plant life. And we feel that sense of relationship through our connection.
Here's some more questions. Sally says, I have earnestly tried to eat more veggies and be a pescatarian, but it's really hard. She says, what suggestions do you have, Frances Moore Lappé?
Find a buddy and experiment. I mean, I think all of us do better when we have a partner, trying things. We can talk, oh, how'd you like that? How'd you like that? and just peruse. I'd love it if you'd look through our recipes, of course, but just see what sparks your fancy. And when you're walking down the veggie aisle, what appeals to you. But I like that idea really of finding somebody else who wants to experiment and just not saying, oh, I've got to give up something, but rather, oh, maybe I'll add this week, try that. And, oh, I didn't like that as much, but I think if I added that spice, I'd like it even more, So that's the spirit of it, is adventure, is the best for your body, the best for the earth. And so just have fun with it.
Phyllis writes, if we don't eat dairy products, how do we get enough calcium? What plant-based foods are high in calcium since we need so much of it?
Well, I know I'm not an expert on calcium, but it's a good question. But I think so many of again, the particularly nutrient world of peas, beans, and lentils, but I'm sure elsewhere. And if you're concerned, they're very easy to find out. Honestly, I don't think about it, so I haven't gotten a quick answer on it, but it's easy to find on the web, of course. So I just, anything you're worried about, but that's a really great question, because I think if there's a particular nutrient you're worried about, it's so easy to find where that lives. And I think, generally speaking, that if you eat a variety of foods in the plant world, you will be covered. So that's my off the cuff advice.
Absolutely. Here's Dawn, who writes, I've heard the difference between those who eat plant-based diets and vegans is that plant-based people do not base their choice on animal rights and the politics of factory farming, whereas vegans embrace those political aspects of their diet. I'm a vegan and I believe this to be true. What are your thoughts? Frances Moore Lappé.
Yeah, I had thought that vegan just refers to people who eat no animal products at all, no dairy, no meat, and that plant-based is a more open, that you may occasionally eat some in that world, but your primary diet, because often people focus or equate a plant-based diet with a Mediterranean diet, or at least it's put in the same paragraph, where there's much less meat. So I say I'm plant-based, plant and planet-based, but I don't eat meat, but I'm not a vegan because I do eat some dairy. So I wouldn't worry about these labels, and move in the direction of what feels right for you and your body.
I mean, I think embedded in that question was that maybe vegans are doing more for the planet than the vegetarians. I don't want to start a fight here, but
well, yes, I mean, I try to be as vegan as I can, and so I do limit my dairy, and maybe I'm moving more and more. Maybe I will be a vegan soon, but again, it's moving along that pathway, and so I like your question.
Here's a question from Beth. The hardest thing is having healthy plant-based snacks on the ready instead of easy to grab prepackaged snacks. Care to share your favorite snacks?
Well, I love nuts, and nuts are just, I love peanuts and walnuts and almonds, and they're just great for us. And, I love, just slapping some peanut butter on toast if I have in a rush. So I'm trying to think, I don't think, also just fruit is such a wonderful snack. I love these wonderful apples that we have right now. And apples and peanut butter, I especially love. Yeah. So, I think just not having these highly processed foods in the home is the first, because they are addictive, and they've been engineered to be addictive. And so don't feel like you're something wrong with you if you find them hard to resist. And I think the only way to do it is just not have them in the home, and just experiment until you develop taste for things that especially meet your fancy as a snack.
Let me ask you a kind of a more policy-based question. And I'm thinking of these, the sort of agribusiness that defines so much of the food that we purchase and produce. And the argument being that, well, you need these big farms because in order to feed the world, you need to be able to have giant silos filled with whatever to export all over the world. What is the diet for a small planet response to that?
Well, I think that is the biggest myth of all, because in terms of feeding the world, people can feed themselves. That's the goal. How do people get access to the land to feed themselves? And what I love to share in the new opening chapter is the growth of people's movements, the landless workers movement. In Brazil, for example, 200 million farmers. And I tell the story of your UK professors who looked all over the world and found this fast uprising of small local groups cooperating together to grow food healthfully. And just over a 20-year period, these small local groups of often very poor people who've come together and are growing food, healthy food for themselves, went from 500,000 to 8 million such groups around the world in 53 countries. Anyway, a huge number. And I was just so encouraged by that. And fortunately, I've gotten to meet some of those people and be so inspired by them. I tell the story of one of the poorest people in India, Dalit, the lowest caste women in India, villages there who've joined together and moved all to organic and multi-cropping. So they're getting a whole variety of nutrition. And before they told me, they said, before we moved in this direction, we were hungry every day.
Wow.
And now they have their own radio station where they're telling their neighbors about how to do what they did. And they have no hunger. They told me now, no hunger.
That's the model. I mean, is that that's what we should be shooting for,
well,
so to speak?
Yeah, I kind of went from your question, but it's not the idea that we are feeding the world is the place to, just reject that frame, because that throughout the world, it is how do we get out of the way? How do we remove the obstacles from people feeding themselves? And we have big, very wealthy people and corporations who are grabbing land, cheap land in the global South, making that harder. And so our policies have to make it easier for people to gain access to land to feed themselves. That is the solution. It's not our growing crops here and shipping them there.
That that has to shift. There's also a story you tell, I believe it's a country in Africa, where the farmers learn to both plant trees and plant plants, and the sort of coexistence between those two kinds of living things.
Yes, I love it that you asked me that, Marty, because agroforestry it's called. And I only learned that, I don't know, it's a number of years ago, but the idea that I always thought, that trees and crops compete, because growing up in Texas, all I could see when we left town, were these rows and rows and rows of one thing, one crop feed. And so what they've discovered, and of course, this has been known for a long time with indigenous peoples throughout the world, that actually trees and crops complement each other, because the trees, especially in Africa, where there can be a lot of sun onto the soil that can dry up the water really fast. So when the trees help cool the soil and the tree leaves help provide fodder, which is kind of fertilizer for the soil, that you can get higher yields and you can get, fodder but also fruit from the trees. And I have a quote in the book from a little boy in Niger in Africa who said, yeah, if my mom doesn't have any food, I can just go out in the field and get some fruit to eat. And because of this integration. And so I think we've got to drop this idea of these monocultures and embrace the idea of this diversity. And I want to point out that, as I said, people understood this for a long time. And in Niger, a lot of it was really retrieving their pre-colonial practice of mixing trees and crops that was wiped out by the French. And so it was really discovery of what was indigenous knowledge. And I want to always honor that.
That's a great story. Robin asks, where do you see GMOs in the future, especially in terms of nutrition and climate adaptation?
Well, I think GMOs are a huge problem. One, because again, it's a monocropping approach, and they are tied to glyphosate, use of a carcinogen that has so harmed people that Monsanto has had to pay out, now Bayer Monsanto it is, had to pay out billions of dollars in damages to farmers who have gotten cancer. And so this is not the direction. Moving away from this fast monoculture approach is the direction, and certainly away from pesticides and harmful pesticides. Absolutely.
We've been talking about monoculture, and I want to ask you also about seeds. And you write about the fact that, decades ago, there were many different kinds of seeds if you wanted to grow corn or, broccoli or whatever. And now it's what, just a handful of seeds, right?
Yeah, well, the whole food industry in our country has now become monopolized. What I mean by that is that I believe when I started out, there were something like 50 seed companies competing for farmers' business, and now are 3 or 4 in beef processing, in chicken processing, you name it, in fertilizer, whatever. There are just a few companies, a few corporations. And so farmers then have much less bargaining power. And they are then at the mercy of the prices that are demanded by these very tightly held monopolies, or oligopolies at least, I guess would be the more technical term. But that is, again, the crisis of democracy, because I think I pointed out earlier that agribusiness has more lobbyists in Washington than does the oil and gas industry. And so that is one of the reasons that we have, moved in this direction. And that can be changed as we work for democracy. I want to point out that on that score, my organization, Small Planet Institute, has a website that we co-created called democracymovement.us. And it's really easy to remember, democracymovement.us. So in addition to our passion about food, which is always who I am too, I feel I can go there and find out something very specific I can do on a burning democracy question. And I can go to my state also and find out what's happening there. And so I'm not suggesting that if you are really an activist in the good food world, go for it. But I'm saying, in addition, just some of your effort could go into making your voice heard as a citizen for our democracy.
Here's a question from Anne, who says, what do you think of intensely managed, humane, but non-vegetarian farming practices? And then she mentions a farm. And there are farms that raise animals for meat, for slaughter, for meat, but they're raised, and I'm using quotation marks here, humanely. What do you think of that?
Well, it's better. Definitely.
It is better.
And that's, all I can say. I mean, that's that anything that reduces suffering is better. But I think we always have to be asking, how can I do even better? And that's the great joy of learning, is to ask the question behind the question. Okay, that's good, but what's even better than that? So that's the spirit that I like to promote.
And I feel your spirit. I hear your spirit. And I wonder, is this always the way you are? Which is, hopeful and embracing and enthusiastic. Is it with, a 15-year-old Frances Moore? Were you, did you sound like this?
I don't know. I was a cheerleader.
Oh, you were? For what,
in
the
Texas.
football team?
Yeah.
For the football team?
So I guess it started early. I love jumping up and down and saying, yes, 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 So I guess I'm still a cheerleader for our earth.
Oh, that's great. What kind of uniform did you wear? Do you remember?
Yeah, I have my ring on from high school. We were the Poly Parrots, and Polytechnic High School in Fort Worth, Texas. And wow. It was orange and black with a big, parrot. Yeah.
And pom-poms, I'm assuming?
Oh, of course.
JMI says eating mainly plant-based can be a lot of work, discovering new twists and tastes. Any recent additions for you? I mean, are you still discovering foods that you might not have eaten before, or food combinations that are new to you?
I'm trying to think of an example. Um, hmm. Uh, it's always for me. I mean, I've lived long enough that it's a lot of more of rediscovering things that I'd kind of forgotten. But I've become a big fan of lately of eggplant and eggplant casseroles. And I don't know, eggplant is really absorbs the seasoning, and it holds its flavor so much. And I guess eggplant might be in that category. But I have to say, I was just really wild about this carrot and onion soup we made last night.
Oh, I'm going to have to check
So
that out.
easy. It's so easy.
You live up in Massachusetts, where I know I used to live there. The winters are long. Do you have a garden? Do you grow your own veggies?
No, I don't. I'm 100% up here in here.
Oh, you're up there.
I'm really I feel like to be consistent, I should be a gardener, but I guess you can't do it all. So
No,
um, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You pointed to your head, so it's you like thinking about this stuff, not necessarily putting your hands into the soil.
Yeah, I'd love to do both, but there's only so many hours in the day, I guess.
Well, that is true.
So we each do what we can do, and that's what I hope that you'll forgive me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm also wondering, like 50 years ago, so this was your very first book.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's,
I've got to say, Marty, I made a D on my first English paper in college.
Oh.
So never did I expect to be a writer. So yes, it was my first book. I started with a one-page handout.
And then what, you started shopping it around?
Well, no, I kept thinking, oh, you should know more about that. You should know a little bit more about that. And so it kept getting longer, and it got into a little booklet. And then Lloyd, who I mentioned earlier, knew somebody at Ballantine Books, and he got my little booklet into the hands of the founder of paperback publishing in America, Betty Ballantine, she and her husband. And the rest is history, as the cliche goes. And she was the most delightful human being, and came out to my house in California, and I made her lunch. And she said when she left, whoever publishes your book, I'll buy it. And then Betty's idea was the recipes. That was her idea. And so I said, great. And so I got on the phone to all my friends and said, send me your favorite veggie recipes. And I remembered people I'd met across the country where I had a really great veggie food, and I called them. And so the recipes started coming in, and then I started playing with them in the kitchen. And that's how the first recipes were done.
What did you make for her for lunch? Do you remember?
Actually, I made a version of the carrot and onion soup. And that's why it has a special place in my heart.
Oh my gosh. Something that's really a theme in your life there. Here's a question from Joan, who says, can you speak about the value of eating organic food?
Oh, absolutely. I think the more that we can, first of all, remember that half of farmers are poisoned every year by pesticides. So when you
half of farmers who are farming are
are poisoned. And so when you are choosing organic, just think about it. You are helping free people from that exposure, because you're creating that market that's safe for farmers and farm workers. So it's not just for your own. Yes, I don't want those chemicals in my body, but it's also for the farm workers and also for the biodiversity. I start my new chapter, quoting David Attenborough, the great natural historian, who said, we are facing the 6th great extinction. And we have destroyed so much of insect population that 40% of our insects are expected to be gone in the next few decades. And a lot of that is the pesticides we use. So yes, it's for not wanting to put that into my body, but it's also for the farmers and all of the forms of life that we are protecting by not exposing them to this harm.
Well, thinking of all the runoff from farms and,
Oh,
the
yes. And
pesticides that roll
yes,
into bodies of water.
yes, I want to mention that also because I talk about that is we don't realize how much pesticides and also the chemicals of fertilizers run into the Mississippi, eventually into the Gulf of Mexico. We have created a dead zone there that is bigger than many of our states. So that this is a worldwide problem of dead zones that are being created because of agricultural runoff primarily. So many reasons to eat organic and to feel great about it.
Here's a question from Catherine. She says, I'm wondering if you have looked at the problem of corn production, not only for grain, but for high fructose corn syrup that goes into so many products. Someone earlier talked about labels. I mean, if you look at a label, there is corn syrup, right? High fructose corn syrup.
Yes, and maybe a lot of people don't know how bad that is for us because as you know, heavy intakes of sweeteners, of sugar in all forms, is a contributor to the massive problem we have today, the massive crisis of diabetes. And we are, since I wrote Diet, there's the rate of diabetes burden in our country has grown by 4 to 5 fold. And it is a very serious problem. So that is, I'm so glad you asked that because eating in this way, of this plant and plant-intensive way, we can just avoid those processed foods that often have, we don't even aware that the sugar or the high fructose corn syrup is in there and contributing to disease. And so I'm so glad you asked that.
Here's a question from Judy. She wants to know, do you take supplements like vitamins? She goes on to say, really do love the change your book made in my life. I've been a veggie since 1974. Do you take supplements?
I do take vitamins, definitely. I take a multi, and I also take calcium. So, I just like to cover all my bases. So I think, I think it's such an individual question, and looking at when you get your medical checkup and seeing if you, if that's good for you, but it's so individual. But I feel, yeah.
Final comment from Claire. She says, I've been eating your walnut loaf as our weekly staple for years. I veganized it in the last years. Thank you. Thank you for being a political warrior as well. How do you see the world in 20 years from now? Still fighting for the same things we've been fighting for 50 years? Well, so when you look into your crystal ball, what do you see?
Well, I have seen such incredible change from my youth to today. And now with the climate crisis, and with so much greater access to information, and with the biodiversity crisis, the 6th great extinction, we are at a moment of truth. And I just feel that the new generation coming up, it's not possible to know what's possible. And I think it's possible that we could make a huge and very fast turn. So I love that question. And I hope that you can stay with that sense of possibility. And I'd love to see your vegan interpretation of the walnut cheddar.
Well, let me add on one more question, because you write, 50 years ago, being plant-based was a choice in many ways, but now it feels like it's closer to a necessity. I mean, that we're really at this critical juncture.
That's exactly how I feel. I feel what was good a choice then is now absolutely essential for life on Earth as we've known it. And what a wonderful thing every day to feel that the choices you're making are helping to save this planet that we love. And nothing is more personal, than that we do every day, that is putting food into our mouths. And so I just hope that is a spirit in which my work is received, that this is soul satisfying, body satisfying, earth helping, and other human beings also enabling them to thrive. So it's just a win, 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 win. And that is, I think, what we're waking up to.
Well, that is a perfect place to end our conversation. Frances Moore Lappé, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. Really enjoyed and appreciate our conversation.
Well, I hope you could tell how much I enjoyed. Thank you.
You're welcome.